Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Pei Zayin. Daf Paz. Paz means gold. I also have a friend named Paz. Daf Pei Zayin of Masechta Pesachim. It's taka an interesting daf. We begin with the 8th perek of Masechta Pesachim. So the perek begins talking about if a wife is yotze with the korban pesach of her husband and how that works out, and from there we get into basically a lot of Agadata. So there's some interesting stuff in that Agadata. Here we go. Top of Pei Zayin, ha'isha, a woman, bisman she beves baila, when she is in her husband's house, shachat alea baila. So if her husband slaughters a korban pesach for her, V'shachat alea avia, but also her father slaughtered a korban pesach for her, tochel mishal baila. So she should go along with the korban pesach of her husband, because the assumption is that her da'as, her intention, was to be with his, to be included in her husband's korban pesach. Halcha regel rishon lasos beveis avia. If for the first holiday she went to her father's house, right? So they got married. My brother got married on Purim L'maaseh. So whatever. Basically, if it was Pesach and it was the first, it was their first holiday together, and they went to her father's house, shachat alea avia v'shachat alea baila. If now both her father and her husband slaughtered a paschal lamb for her, tocha b'makom shirotza, so then she can join whichever group she wants and eat from whichever korban pesach she wants on that first Pesach that they are together and at her father's house. Yosem sheshachtu alav apotropsin. If you have an orphan and there are two sort of representatives who are supposed to be representing the interests of the orphan, so if there are two of these representatives, yochab makom shirotza, so if they each slaughtered a paschal lamb for this fellow, so he can choose whichever apotropis he would like to join. Eved shel shnei shutfin, if you have a slave belonging to two owners, to two partners, lo yochel mishal shnein, well, he can eat from neither one of their korban pesach, because if he wants to eat from Ruvain's, well, half of him is owned by Shimon, who says that Shimon is going to allow his half to go to Ruvain and be included in his korban pesach. So in order for a slave to be able to eat a korban pesach, in that case, one of the masters is going to have to be okay with the slave eating with the other master. If you have a fellow who is half free and half slave, well, he cannot eat korban pesach with his master, because his master only has intention to slaughter the korban pesach for the half of the slave that's enslaved, but the free half he didn't have intention. But we need the whole slave to be included in the korban pesach, so that won't work. Zok the Gemara shmasmina yesh breira, from the fact that we say that a newly married woman who goes to her father's house for the first Pesach, and her husband slaughters a lamb for her, and her father slaughters a lamb for her. So it sounds like at the time that, when it comes time to eat korban pesach, she can choose, and she can decide how she's feeling at that time, and decide if she wants to chaper ein in the husband's korban pesach or in her father's korban pesach, which sounds like, of course, the concept of breira, of retroactively telling stuff, as we described in Masechta Eruvin, photoshopping. Ki'ilu, it sounds like, from the fact that she's deciding b'shas ma'aseh, at the time that she's going to eat the korban pesach, which korban pesach she wants to eat, and we know that a korban pesach has to be eaten specifically to its group. So we're saying we can go back in time now and say that her intention was, at the time that the korban pesach was slaughtered, to be included in that particular korban pesach that she's now eating. So we could see that sort of retroactively we can go back and say, okay, so it's clear that her intention was to be included in this particular Korban Pesach that she's about to eat. So the Gemara answers, not necessarily. Ma'irotze b'shas shchita. No, when it says that she can partake in either Korban Pesach that she wants, it means that at the time that we slaughter the Korban Pesach, we ask her the Maisa. We say, hey, which Korban Pesach do you want to be included in? Do you want to be included in the husband's Korban Pesach? Do you want to be included in the father's Korban Pesach? And whatever she says, we then slaughter accordingly. Vira minu. Now we have a kasha. Because in our Mishnah we said that by default, a woman is included in her husband's Korban Pesach. Now, we said that the first Pesach, however, if both her husband and her father slaughtered a Korban Pesach first, she can choose. She has the choice. Now, we have a brisa which seems to be giving a little bit of a different story here, which is Isha regala rishon ocheles mishel avia. We have a brisa which is saying that when a woman gets married, so then the first Pesach shall davka be included in her father's Korban Pesach. Not like our Mishnah said, which is that she could choose either her father's or her husband's. And mikan ve'elach rotzo ocheles mishel avia rotzo mishel baila. And then from then and on, she has the choice. Either she can eat from her father's or from her husband's, whereas in our Mishnah, we seem to be saying that by default, a woman would be included in her husband's Korban Pesach. Yet we seem to be saying that by default, kilu, every other Pesach other than the first one, she can choose either her husband's or her father's. So the Gemara says, Lo kasha kan b'redufa leilech kan b'shein redufa. So it depends on the case. Kilu, if it's a woman who is going back to her father's house all the time, so then that is what the Brisa is talking about. Exactly. That's what the Brisa is talking about. So if you have a woman who's constantly going back to her father's house, she hasn't yet necessarily settled into her husband's house, so then that's what the Brisa is saying, which is that the first regel, the first Pesach, then without a doubt she's going to be interested in being included in her father's Korban Pesach, and then after that, since she's still is going back to her father's house all the time, so we have to ask her, whose Korban Pesach do you want to be included in? However, if you have a woman who gets married and she just settles in with her husband elsewhere and doesn't necessarily go back to her father's house all the time, so then Davka, the first regel, so we'll ask her, do you want to be included in your husband's Korban Pesach or your father's? But after that, by default, she'll be included in her husband's Korban Pesach. As it says in the pasuk, Ozayisi be'enov k'motzei shalom. So pasuk in Shir Hashirim, it says, and then I was in his eyes like finding peace. Rabbi Yochanan says, it's like a bride who is whole in her father's house. Interestingly, in her father-in-law's house. Interestingly, my grandmother has been living here for the past 2 weeks or so, and she just got this aide to come spend some time with her. And the aide is from Georgia, the country. And she said that in Georgian, Sruli means whole, W-H-O-L-E. Isn't that interesting? Akoponim. So we're saying that it's like a bride who is whole in her father-in-law's house, i.e. that she feels comfortable, completely comfortable in her father-in-law's house, and she can't wait to go to her own father's house to describe to him how well things are going by her new father-in-law. It's written in the pasuk, and it will be on that day, the word of God, Tikri Ishi, V'lo tikri li od baili. You will call to me my man, you will not call to me my husband, or I guess my owner. Meaning, what we're going here for the metaphor is like a bride in the house of her father-in-law, i.e. that she feels comfortable in the house of her father-in-law, as opposed to a bride in the house of her father, meaning she's always running back to her father's house. Now, was the tradition to they would get married and then move in with the father-in-law? Is that the point? That they would get married and move in with the father-in-law, and when a woman gets married, she kind of moves in with the husband? Is that the idea? Maybe. Is that a thing? And then So then, we're talking about, we're gauging how comfortable she feels at her new father-in-law's house. Achos lanu katana v'shadayim ein lo. So the pasuk says in Shir Hashirim that our sister is small and she doesn't yet have breasts. Amr Rabbi Yochanan zo Elam. Says Rabbi Yochanan that is a reference to Elam. Elam is where Daniel was. Shezachsa lilmod v'lo zachsa lelamed. That Daniel, he learned a whole bunch of Torah, but he didn't necessarily teach and spread so much Torah. So therefore it's like this young girl who doesn't have any breasts referring to being able to nurse, being able to disseminate life. And since Daniel, he had all this Torah, but he didn't disseminate it, so he's like this younger sister who does not have breasts. Anichoma v'shadai kamigdalos. I am a wall, and my breasts are like fortresses. Amr Rabbi Yochanan. Anichoma zotorah v'shadai kamigdalos elu tamidei chacham. So it says Rabbi Yochanan, building on this similar metaphor, that when it says that I am a wall, so that's referring to the Torah. And when it says, and my breasts are like fortresses, that's a reference to Talmidei Chachamim, who disseminate the Torah and spread the Torah. Rave Amar, says Rave, Anichom zo Knesset Yisrael, that when it says I am a wall, that's a reference to Am Yisrael. V'shadai kamigdalos, and my breasts are like fortresses, Elubate Knesios uvate Midrashos. These are the synagogues and the study halls which protect, kamigdalos, like fortresses that protect against Am Yisrael. What does the pasuk mean? Asher banenu kantim megudalim benureim, that our sons are like these plants that grow up in their youth. Benosenu kizavios mechutavos tavnes heichal, and our daughters are like the corners built into the heichal in the Beis Hamikdash. Asher banenu kanatim, when it's a reference to our sons being like these trees. These are the young men of Israel who have never tasted the taste of sin. And our daughters are like the corners of the Heichal. These are the virgins of Israel, who preserve their entrances to their bodies for their husbands. And similarly, it says, Umalu kamizrak kizavios mizbeach, and they will be filled up like sort of these receptacles that we throw onto the mizbeach. We throw like the dam of the korbanos onto the mizbeach. And Rashi explains that that's a reference, just like it says umalu in this pasuk, by these receptacles that we use to throw things onto the mizbeach. So also these daughters who are filled with desire, and yet either they hold it in while to wait for their husbands, or when they're in nida. Or if you wanted to say from here, mizavenu meleim mefikim mizanazan, that the very next pasuk after this, benosenu kizavios, it says mizavenu meleim, that our corners are filled mefikim mizanazan, with like lots of grain and stuff, with lots of food and sustenance. But that's also a reference to being filled, and a reference to these women who are filled with desire but preserve it for their husbands. Mechutavos tavnes heichal, they are built, they are hewn into the heichal. Elu ve'elu ma'ila alein hakasov kilu nivna heichal b'imein, that both these young men and these young women, we treat it as if the heichal of the sanctuary of the Beis Hamikdash was built in their days. Sounds nice. Interesting. We're going to learn about the prophet Hosea. Some interesting inyanim about him. B'mei Uzio Yosam Achaz Yechizkiah Malchi Yehuda, and it was during the days of the four kings, Uzio, Yosam, Achaz, and Yechizkiah. We're going to get back to them a little bit later. That at one point there were four prophets who prophesied, and Hosea was the greatest of all of them. Very interesting. Okay, so there were four prophets at that time who were prophesying at the same time. Hosea was the greatest one. We're going to see who they are soon. Shnemar, as the pasuk says, Tchilas Dvar Hashem beHosea, that it was when the Eibishter began to speak with Hosea. Hosea diber tchila. Did the Eibishter speak first with Hosea? V'alo mimoshe ad Hosea kam neviim. Hosea wasn't the first prophet. From Moshe Rabbeinu until Hosea, there were lots of prophets. Says Rabbi Yochanan that however Hosea was the greatest of the 4 prophets who prophesied at that time, and who were they? It was Hosea, Yeshaya, Amos, and Micha. They all prophesied at the same time, and Hosea was the greatest. The Eibishter said to Hosea, your sons have sinned. And what Hosea should have responded was, what do you mean? Eibishter, they're your sons. They're the ones who you have mercy on. The sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Have mercy upon them. That's what he should have said. However, says the Gemara, not only did he not say this, he said the opposite. The fun of he says, Master of the world, so Hosea says, alright, it's true, they are a bunch of nudniks, but what do you want from me? The whole world belongs to you, Eibishter. Swap them out for a different nation. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu ma'aseh l'zaken zeh. David, does what's called a face palm, and he says, what am I supposed to do with this guy? Omar lo, if I say to Hosea, lech v'kach isha zona v'oded l'chab, no, I'm sorry, Omar, this is what I'll do. This is my plan. I will say to him, lech v'kach isha zona, go and find yourself a harlot, v'oded l'chabanim znunim, and father children with a prostitute. Right? He says, b'nei znunim, meaning children with this prostitute, but also kilu, you can't even say with 100% certainty that they're even your children. And then afterwards, I will say to Hosea, shilcha me'al panecha. And then I will say to him, now that you have children with this prostitute, go and release her. Go and get rid of her, leave her. And if he is able to send away this prostitute who he had children with, then if he could send her away, I'll send away Israel. Shinemar, as the pasuk says, Vayomer Hashem el Hosea, that the Eibishter says to Hosea, Lech kach l'cha eshes znunim v'yaldei znunim, go and find for yourself, go and take for yourself a prostitute for a wife and have questionable offspring with her. Uchsev, in the pasuk says, Vayelech v'ikach es gomer bas divloim. And it says that Hosea obliged, and he found for himself Gomer bas divloim, Gomer, Amarav shakol Gomer ba. Says Rav, what does it mean that her name was Gomer, to finish? It means that all the men would finish inside of her. Bas divloim, dibara bas dibara. What does divloim mean? It means that she was like a prostitute, as was her. She comes from it was a family industry. Family profession. Shmuel Amar says, Shmuel, Shemesuka b'fi'ako kedvela. What does it mean? Divloy mean? It's like devela, like fig cakes, that she was sweet in everybody's mouth, like figs. Rabbi Yochanan Amar says, Rabbi Yochanan shakol dashin ba kedvela, that everybody threshes in her like fig cakes. Okay? Davracher, a different explanation. Gomer, what does it mean? Gomer, that they wanted to be a male, that they wanted to get rid of all of the money of Israel, to deplete all of Israel in her days. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Bazazu v'gamu, says Rabbi Yochanan, the Taka did loot and finish all of the money of Israel in her days. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Ki avda melech Aram v'yisimim kafir ladush, that the king of Aram got rid of them and made them like dust to thresh. Vatar v'tele bein. No, vatar v'tele lo bein. So now Gomer bas divloim got pregnant and birthed a child. Vayomer Hashem Elav, and the Eibishter says to Hosea, Krashmo Yisrael, call his name Yisrael, Kod matu fakadti es deme Yisrael al beis Yehu, because in another little bit, I'm going to remember to extract the blood of Yisrael from the house of Yehu, Vishbati Mamluchus Beis Yisrael, and I'm going to get rid of the kingship of Israel. Vatar od vateled bas, and then she had another child, a daughter. Vayomer lo, and the Eibishter says to Hosea, Krashma lo ruchama, call her name lo ruchama, not mercy. Ki lo osif od arachim es Beis Yisrael, because I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel. Kinoso esa loem, because I will no longer sort of carry their burden. Vatar vateled bein, then she had a third child, a son. Vayomer, and the Eibishter says to Hosea, Krashmo lo ami, call his name not my nation. Ki atem lo ami, vanochi lo eye lochem, because you are not my nation, and I will no longer be for you. So now, after Hosea had two sons and a daughter with Gomer bas Divloim, Amula Kadosh Baruch Hu Hosea, the Eibishter says to Hosea, shouldn't you have learned from Moshe Rabbeinu, your teacher, that once I began to speak with Moshe Rabbeinu, he separated from his wife Tzipporah. So Hosea knew, if I'm going to be speaking with you, don't you think that you should separate yourself from Gomer bas Divloim? Amrlo, Ribono shel Olam. So now Hosea says to the Eibishter, he says, Master of the world, Yesh li banim mimena, but I have children with her. Ve'ein ani yachol lotzia v'lo legarsha. I can't just get rid of her and to divorce her. Amalei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Eibishter says to Hosea, Uma'ata, look at yourself, Hosea, she'ishtecha zona, that your wife is a harlot, uvanecha b'nei znunim, and your children are offspring from her. And you don't know, you can't even say for sure that these are actually your own kin. These are actually your own children. I don't know if kin means children. And kach. And yet, this is how you feel. Right? The Eibishter is saying to Hosea, in this case, you see how difficult it is for you to get rid of your wife and your children in such a questionable circumstance. Yisrael shein banai, the Yidden who are my children, b'nei bachuni, the children of my mercy, b'nei Avram, Yitzchak, v'Yakov, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Echad me'arba kinyanin shekanisi b'olami, one of the 4 acquisitions that I made in my world, and now the Gemara lists what those 4 acquisitions are. Torah kinyan echad, the Torah is one acquisition. The pasuk says, Hashem kanani reishes darko, that the Eibishter purchased me reishes darko, and that's a reference to the Torah, the beginning of his way. Shemaim v'aretz kinyan echad, the heaven and the earth are one kinyan. The pasuk says, Kone shemaim v'aretz, that the Eibishter is the owner of heaven and earth. Beis Hamikdash kinyan echad, the harze konsu yamino, that it says about the Beis Hamikdash that it is this mountain that the right hand of the Eibishter acquired. Yisrael kinyan echad, and the Yidden are a kinyan. The pasuk says, Amzu kanisa, this nation that you purchased. New. So the Yidden are my children. They are one of the 4 kinyanin that I made in the world. Vata amart havirim buma acheres, and you, Hosea, are suggesting that I should just swap them for a different nation? That sounds silly, Hosea. Once Hosea recognized that he sinned, so he stood up to request mercy for himself. The Eibishter says to him, instead of asking for mercy for yourself, ask mercy for the Yidden. Because, as is evidenced by the 3 names of your children that I suggested that you name them, I have decreed 3 gezeras against the Yidden. I I think maybe wait. Probably. So Hosea stood up and he asked for mercy and he nullified the decrees. And he began to bless the Yidden. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, "Vayimisbar b'nei Yisrael kol hayom v'gomer." That and the numbers of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. And I think that was right. Okay, fine. No, what's the pasuk? Pasuk ches. Right. Oh, okay. Oh, I see. Okay, fine. So the pasuk says, "Vaya mispar b'nei Yisrael kol hayam v'gomer." That the numbers of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. Vaya b'mkom asher yomer loim lo amiatem, yomer loim b'nei kel chai. That instead of saying that you are not my nation, rather we will say that they are the sons of the living God. So we see that so his second son was named Lo Ami. So we say that in place of being Lo Ami, you will be the Bnei Kel Chai. V'nikbetzu Bnei Yehuda V'nei Yisrael Yachdav V'gomer. And the sons of Judah and Israel will get together, which is like getting rid of the first Gezer, where he said that he's going to scatter them. V'zeratili ba'aretz v'richamti es lo ruchama. And I will plant them in the earth, and I will have mercy on Lo Ruchama, the one that I did not have mercy on, a reference to the daughter who he suggested should be named Lo Ruchama. V'amarti lo Ami, Amiota, and I will say to Lo Ami, you are in fact my nation. So we see that the Eibishter nullified the Gezeres. Omer Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Yochanan, Oila l'Rabbanu shemekaber, says, Bailea, woe is to rulership, is to power, that it buries those who have the power. That each of these Nevi'im had 4 kings who died during their life. Shneimar, as it says, basically, we had mentioned 4 prophets earlier. Let's see if I can remember them. Hosea, Yeshaya, Amos, and Micha. And by all of them, it lists these 4 kings. Achaz, what was it? No, where are you? Uzziah, Yosam, Achaz, Yechizkiyahu. All 4 of these kings were alive basically they had all 4 of the kings during these 4 prophets. So we see that the kings died at a very frequent rate, that there were 4 of them in the reign of these prophets. How come Yeravam ben Yoash merited to be counted with the 4 kings of Judah? Because he didn't listen to Lashon Hara that was reported to him, that was said to him about Amos, the prophet Amos. Minolan de'imne, where do we see that Yeravam ben Yoash was listed with these 4 kings of Judah? The pasuk says, Dvar Hashem asher haya el Hoshea ben Be'eri, that the word of God was to Hoshea ben Be'eri, B'mei Uzziah Yosam Achaz Yechizkiah Malchei Yehuda, during these 4 kings of Judah, Uv'mei Yoravam ben Yoash Melech Yisrael, and during the days of Yoravam ben Yoash, the king of Israel. So we see that he was listed together with them. And how do we know that? How do we know what? That Yoravam ben Yoash did not receive Lashon Hara. The pasuk says, "Vayishlach Amatzia Kohen Beisel El Yoravam Melech Yisrael Lemor," that Amatzia sent a priest of Avodah Zarah to Yoravam Melech Yisrael, to Beisel Lemor, to say Kasher Alecha V'Gomer, to report to Yoravam that Amos was planning to rebel against him. Uchsiv, in the pasuk says, Ki Chay Omer Amos B'Chayv Yamos Yoravam V'Gomer, that Amos was prophesying that Yoravam was going to die by the sword. Omar, and says Yoravam, Chas v'shalom, he says, God forbid, Omar osu tzadikach, God forbid that tzaddik Amos said such a thing. V'im Omar, and if in fact he did say such a thing, ma'eh elo shchina amarlo. What am I supposed to do? It's not him speaking, it's the Eibishter speaking. So we see that Yoravam refused to accept Lashon Hara from this representative. Omer Belazar says Rabbi Elazar, afilu b'shas kaisu shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even at the time that the Eibishter is upset, Zocher Sarachamim, he remembers mercy. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, Kilo Osif Od Arachim is Beis Yisrael. How does the Eibishter say that he's going to be upset and punish the Yidden? He says, I will no longer have mercy. So even being upset is in the context of a lack of mercy. Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina Amar Me'acha Kinasu Es Elayim. That we saw the pasuk earlier, that the Eibishter says, I will no longer continue to bear their burden, to carry this weight. So again, even punishment is in the context of the Eibishter carrying sort of the burdens and the weight of Israel. Interesting concept, that the Eibishter only exiled the Yidden so that they can come back with converts. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, "V'zeresiya li ba'aretz," that I will plant them in the land, in the earth. Klum adam zareh sa'a el hachnis ba kamakorin. Why does a person plant a saw? Why does a person plant? He plants so that he will harvest a lot more than he plants. Meaning it's an investment. You plant a certain amount, but the intention is really to bring back with you ultimately much more. Rabbi Yochanan says from here, that I will have mercy on lo ruchama, and then it says, V'amarti lo ami amiota, and I will say to lo ami, you are my nation. I.e., in this context, to those who are not Jewish, you are my nation, i.e., they will become converts. Interesting. What does the pasuk mean? Al talshin eved el adonov penikalelcha ve'al shamta. Do not speak negatively of a servant in front of his master, lest the master curse you and you will be ashamed. Immediately the next pasuk says, Dor aviv yikal ves imo lo yivarech. A nation who curses their father and does not bless their mother. Mishum da'aviv yikal ves imo lo yivarech al talshin. Just because, right? So meaning these are two psukim right next to each other in Mishlei. So what's the connection? Well, just because you have a nation that curses their father and will not bless their mother, therefore you shouldn't curse a servant in front of his master? Like, what's the connection? Even a generation that is a bunch of nudniks, that they curse their father and they will not bless their mother, even so, do not speak negatively about a servant in front of his master. We see that from Hosea, that even though the Yidden at the time were being a bunch of nudniks, still Hosea says to the Eibishter, okay, so just get rid of them, and still the Eibishter got very insulted. So we see that even if let's say children or whatever, or a servant, whatever, something that somebody cares about, even if they're being nudniks, think twice before speaking derogatorily about these people in front of their parent or master, if it's a servant. Amar Boshai says, Boshai, what does the pasuk mean? Tzidkas perzono b'Yisrael. The righteousness of his perzono b'Yisrael. What does that mean? That the Eibishter actually did a service for the Yidden to scatter them among the nations, so that it will be more difficult to get rid of us. If we're all in one place, so then if you have a big nudnik with a big device of sorts, and he can make a big kind of explosion of sorts, and he can get rid of all the Yidden in one shot, but that wouldn't be good for us. So the Eibishter, he spread us out so that one big device will not suffice. So, where are we? So, and this is what a certain min said to Reb Chanina, we are better than you. It says by you, it says that Yoav hung out in Edom for 6 months and killed everybody. But us, but we have tolerated you for several years and we haven't destroyed you. Midi at all. Amarlo. So Reb Chanina responds, you want me to get somebody who could have a dialogue with you. Nitfalei Rabbi Oshaya. So Rabbi Chanina called over Rabbi Oshaya to have a dialogue with this min. Amarle, and Rabbi Oshaya responded, well, Mishum Delo Yadisu Eichi Ta'avdu. The only reason why you haven't killed us is because you don't have a plan, you don't have a strategy. Tachninan Kulu Lesnu Gabaychu. You can't just kill all of us because we're not all there with you. My Diika Gabaychu. And if you just want to kill the Yidden who are with you, but then you will be called a sort of cut off malchus, because you, like, I don't know whether it's maybe because you're missing a big chunk of your population, or because it would be a kingdom that kills its citizens, which I guess wouldn't be a good reputation to have. To which this min said, holy cow, you Pashut hit the nail on the head. We're always thinking about this, how we can kill you and what the challenges are in our efforts to do so. We'll hold it here. That was Daf Pei Zayin. What did you guys think about Daf Pei Zayin? You liked it, right? It was pretty good. I mean, you guys are amazing. You guys like all the daf, so I guess there's no big difference, but it was a Geshmak daf, no? So, Daf Pei Zayin of Masechta Pesachim, Daf Paz, my friend Paz Feigenbaum from Australia, good man. So we started a new perek, the 8th perek of Masechta Pesachim. So we started with some halachas at the beginning about a wife being included in her husband's korban pesach, and we actually saw 2 different versions of that, and it sort of depends how often a woman goes back to her father's house. If she often goes back to her father's house, well then you can assume that the first pesach that they are married and they go to her father's house for pesach, so you can assume that she's intending to be included in her father's korban pesach, not her husband's. From then on, since she is still connected, goes back to her father's house all the time, she would have the choice either to be part of her husband's korban pesach or part of her father's. If she isn't particularly connected to her father, meaning that she doesn't go back all the time to her father's house, well then the first pesach, we will ask her, do you want to be included in her husband's korban pesach or your father's? But after that, you can assume that she will be included in her husband's korban pesach. And then we got into all sorts of Agadatas, much of it related to the prophet Hosea, who we said was the greatest prophet of his time, even though there were 4 prophets at that time. And the interesting story about what happened when the Eibishter reported to Hosea that the Yidden were being a bunch of nudniks, and Hosea just said, get rid of them. And the scheme that the Eibishter devised to kind of catch him in his steps. And some other interesting Agadatas along the way, like the 4 kinyonim that the Eibishter made in his world, and others. Friends, I hope you enjoyed Daf Pei Zayin. Enjoy your day. Peace out.